Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the second day of the DORS CLUC conference. You're currently in the black hole, where we will have today's presentation, and we're starting with Hans with the topic exploring the synergy of open source software and generative AI models. As we did yesterday after the lecture, please, if you have any questions, raise your hand, and the speaker will repeat it before answering for the stream. And please give a warm welcome to Hans.
All right, good morning, welcome back. So let's try this again. I will talk about open source software, generative AI, how they work together. But first of all, as also mentioned yesterday, I think a very warm applause is in order for the DORS CLUC organization, because they really do manage to pull off this amazing conference every year. And me being a part of HR Open and slightly part of the furniture of DORS CLUC, it's a bit of a home turf here, but again, thank you students, teams, February, everybody else for pulling this off and allowing me to be on this stage. So, that being said, yes. All right, so generative AI and open innovations, so what do they have in common? First of all, open innovations is my own company. I've been running it for about 22 years now. We mainly focus on highly regulated industries like pharmaceutical, healthcare, government. We do data processing, data analysis, AI augmented medical imaging analysis. There's actually a flyer of our company's RNA platform in your conference goodie bag. So look it up, see what we do. And we're also very warmly invested in open source, and actually the communities that we work with, they receive 10% of our annual revenue back as a, well, let's say thank you and support for the amazing work that they do. Open source. I believe, at least for me personally, that when I started programming in the 90s, it was pretty hard to get any form of development environment set up if you don't want to pay like thousands of euros, or in those eras actually guilders. We still had the Dutch guilder. Because you had to pay Borland or you had to pay Microsoft or whomever to get their IDEs, their compilers and whatnot. And then open source came along, and it was a fantastic educational opportunity, mainly because it was just possible to look at code and see how it worked and see look up actual errors in compiling instead of having those amazing error X53008 whatever blah came out of Visual Basic. So for me, open source has always been about being able to stand on the shoulders of giants in building our own software, but also the ability to actually see what was happening and learn from that and apply it on my own. So not just the fact that I can use the code, but also the fact that I can learn from the code and apply its principles and its ingenious nature. So the thing in current days is we don't just have humans that look at code. We also have generative AI models that are analyzing code, but essentially they're doing the same thing. They're observing code, they're looking into the principles and the logic of how it works, and they allow you as a developer within the context of your IDE to get help. Which is actually amazing, because I can't really even start to add up how many years of my life got wasted on browsing Stack Overflow for some answer that usually isn't actually the right answer. And this is also another element of open source in general. When we talk about the open source community, that's not just a uniform single entity. That there are thousands or even millions of individual developers sitting in their basements or attics or living rooms or in some amazing barista coffee cafe and working on stuff. But the thing is, and recently we had this very interesting conversation going on about, I'm an open source developer, I'm not your supplier. Okay, I get that because you publish code and you want other people to use it, but if you're actually not a supplier, what does that mean? Do you also maybe don't want to interact with me because I am actually trying to use your code? I have questions about it. I may have improvements for it. I may have issues with it. If you're not a supplier, or if you are actually just this kind of semi-passive entity just putting stuff out in the world, then how am I actually supposed to judge if what you put forward is actually usable? How can I determine if you are going to be supporting this next year? Because I'm including your code in my platform. My platform is being deployed in hospitals and clinics and whatever. The platform is actually used for diagnosis. So essentially I'm trying to save human lives or improve the quality of life using your particular 100 lines of JavaScript that you probably published because you were missing something in another library. So how does this actually work? Supply chain management and supply chain problems have become very apparent in recent years. I don't know when was the last time you've tried to initialize an NPM project and not be completely stupefied about the 10,000 dependencies that get included in there. So when I say Faker JS, what does that mean for anybody? So about a year ago, there was this really pissed off developer, apparently, who deliberately poisoned his own library on GitHub into running infinite loops. And basically, thousands of projects that depended on that one library of this one pissed off developer exploded overnight. So this is about supply chain. How do we actually know what we're including in our code? And this is not just a theoretical problem, it's a practical problem also because there are laws and directives and regulations in the works, and sometimes even already active, that make me as a supplier responsible for whatever it is I put out there, including your 100 lines of JavaScript, which you wrote apparently 10 years ago because something was missing. So supply chain management really is an issue, and also getting code to work together. I think that more than 80% of the development time that we spend on our RNA data management platform, which uses PostgreSQL, PHP Symfony, React.js, Chart.js, and whatnot, I think more than 80% of our development time goes into making components work together instead of actually developing functionality. So this, I mean, me being Dutch, I'm a fan of efficiency and you know, planability and predictability and all those things that, yeah, you know, I like to have an idea of what will happen, let's say, next week, because my customers also like to know what's happening next week. And if we spend 80% of our time figuring out how to make stuff work together that actually nobody intended to work together in the first place, that's a bit of an issue. So how does generative AI fit into this model? Well, I don't think that generative AI will replace programmers anytime soon. I do think it will replace a lot of the work that is administrative, repeatable. So if you're a bookkeeper, a secretary, I should advise maybe taking some courses in generative AI prompting, because otherwise your job will be obsolete. But the thing is, when I made this presentation, I used ChatGPT a lot because I wanted to find out if it would actually be able to give me input into my arguments, into making the statement that generative AI is actually helpful in the open source domain. And you know what? It completely sucked. It was not able to give me a single actual argument that it had not included in its original body of knowledge. So it really is this very smart-looking parrot that just repeats what it already knows, which is, from my perspective as a human, very comforting, because otherwise I would be slightly worried. But still, if you're doing a generic and repeatable task, think back 5 minutes about me rambling about integrating components that don't actually want to be integrated together. If you have a very specific task for it to do, and if you're able to prompt it in a very clear manner, it will do that. So generating tests, integrating pieces of code with a very clearly defined API, or even just looking at source code and figuring out what it does. It's awesome at that. It really is. And if that means that, let's say, this 80% of my developer time can actually be spent on providing value towards either the open source community or my customers or both, I'd be very happy about that. And it all goes back also into what I believe is the main ethical and philosophical aspect of open source. It's transparent, it's open, you're able to see what it does and learn from it. Now, whether that's a human that learns from it or a generative AI model, I don't think there's much of a difference. It's both benefiting from somebody else's knowledge that that person wanted to share with the world. And of course, I'm not deliberately sidestepping the whole question about licensing and if it's even ethical to copy somebody's copyrighted code into anything, but the general principle of I'm an open source developer, I share something with the world, I'm not a supplier, but I do want my stuff to be used. Whether or not that's directly used or used through a generative AI model, that would be actually completely fine with me both. So, I have a background in music. I love music. I actually used to make my money with IT and then spend it on organizing festivals and paying musicians to do the stuff that I suck at, which is making kind of interesting music. I am a drummer. I really like the kind of energy management that gives me, but I wouldn't impose it on anybody to actually listen to me. But the nice thing about what happened in the musical business is 20 years ago, we had these labels. Labels are very monolithic entities who dictated everything. If you were a musician, you had to go to a label, convince them that you're actually awesome, and then if they had already decided that you are awesome or the thing of music that you're doing should be the next thing in the market, they would put you out there. Now that really changed when companies like Spotify came around, and we also had other things like Last.fm and stuff. So what that did was it made an immediate link between you as a musician, as a content creator, and the listener. And what Spotify also did was it kept track of how many times a song was played and how many times people were looking for it. And it based its monetary compensation on those metrics. Now, I don't think it's that stupid of an idea if we, as an open source community, would actually demand a similar thing from the Microsofts and the OpenAIs and the Google. Like, how many times are you sampling my bit of code? Pay me for it. It would solve a huge problem, actually, because I recently read another bit of research where they questioned a couple of hundred open source developers, and 80% of the open source developers actually wants to be paid for their work. No shit. Yeah, but this is actually a way to make that work, because they do know what they generate. If you use Bing Chat, it will tell you all the references of the website that it uses in its answer. It's awesome, you have complete traceability. Plus, it would also maybe encourage people to write bits of code that are meant for reuse instead of just scratching their own functional itch, and make a business model out of publishing such reusable samples, if I may quote the musical analysis, and go forward. So of course, this all depends on if the large parties will also play along, and usually they don't. So we have surveillance capitalism, which is basically meant based on the fact that they use your data to sell you advertisements so that you actually will buy the stuff that they advertise you with your own data. Now, in the EU, it's often said that the one thing that Europe is really good at is providing regulations and laws and rules and all that, but often that's meant as an insult. I actually think that's a compliment, because we really are good at it. We have the GDPR, landmark privacy regulation. In the US, privacy is a consumer right. In the EU, it's a fundamental human right. Slight bit of a difference. So we view stuff differently. And at the moment we have the AI Act coming up, which I believe yesterday was actually postponed again for a couple of months because we can't agree on what it is that general purpose AI is, and of course the definition discussion will go on forever. But the approach that they take, and this is the same with the Cyber Resilience Act as well, is they classify risk based on application. So we are using open source tools in the medical domain. If our tools mess up, people could die. Pretty big risk. If you run a web shop selling Flappy Bird subscriptions, slightly less risk. So the point is, if you use a piece of code, you have to determine, or an algorithm, you have to determine if it's fit for purpose in the scope where you want to apply it. And that may actually differ from the scope that the original creator had in mind, because they may have actually created a bit of code to emulate Flappy Bird, and you're using it into medical diagnosis. So it's up to you to determine that. There are certain definitions of high-risk AI systems, like in law enforcement, education, medical domain. And if you implement systems in that domain, you have to validate what they do. We already do that. We make sure that whatever we specify and configure in our system actually behaves as intended. So the thing about it, also with the US Open Source Security Act, is that you have to be very clear in where you want to use a piece of code and make sure that it is actually tested and fit within that domain. So I think the future for open source communities could actually be moving towards helping generative AI models with reusable bits of code, attribution, and making money from it. So this is essentially the point I tried to make. And I hope you will take it along, and that the open source community will actually move into, let's say, a more supplier-oriented role. Thank you for listening. I think I'm actually on time.
Any questions? You have 10 more minutes, so if anyone has questions, feel free to ask. I'll give you the microphone.
I think we all have a lot of questions, so the 10 minutes will be well spent.
I'll be here all day, so you can also come to me afterwards. And also there will be a talk by FSV later today about rules and regulations. I really recommend going to that talk as well.
Nice. So you mentioned a few use cases for the AI use, like tests and other pieces of code from free software. I wonder if we can trust corporations or proprietary software developers to report and pay for the pieces that they take from the free software community, for free software projects. This is my first question. And
well, my answer is we can't, and that's why we need laws and regulations about that. Because obviously, if you look into advertisement models, there's not at all any form of recurring revenue back to the person who is giving away their data for free, which in fact I believe that Google, Microsoft, Apple should pay us like a basic income for whatever data they take from us.
Okay, and related, the second part of the first question is that even though we have legislation, regulations, we know that corporations find ways to underreport and divert funds and so on.
Yep.
And the second question is whether it is okay from the perspective of the authors of free software projects to break the license practically, because many of the copyleft licenses don't allow reuse of the source code in proprietary software.
Yep, that's a big problem. I think that at the moment everybody's just ignoring those provisions. and it will probably take a couple of class action lawsuits to figure that out, and it's a big problem. So I'm very aware that that is a very moral and ethical issue.
So we probably have to take care of the biggest GPL violation.
Well, I think we need a couple
phenomenon.
of Schrems cases, as what happened with Privacy Shield and Safe Harbor, but then targeting the data, the open source copyleft breaches. But yeah, the problem there, and this is something that I feel the big open source conservatories like the Eclipse Foundation, they should step up on that, because at the moment they're just complaining that they're not involved in about the EU AI Act or the Cyber Resilience Act. Well, there's a saying in Europe, if you're not at the table, then you're on the menu. So if you, as an open source conservatory, feel that you are left out, then make sure that you bloody well are not. Be there at the table. Make sure that your voice is heard. The European legislation process is the most open democratic process in the world. It's not perfect, it's far from perfect, but you always have an opportunity to get at the table. So to answer your question about are they abusing at the moment the liberties that, let's say, publicly visible information gives you, because that's the whole point. We put code out there, it's visible for everybody, it's available for everybody, and then we kind of artificially restrict what people can do with it. So of course people will abuse it. Like the bigger, I think that, in example, Microsoft with GitHub made a very deliberate decision, which is, yeah, we're just going to guzzle up GitHub entirely. We're going to create Copilot, and we'll just see whoever sues us. And to be brutally honest, me being Dutch, I'd do the same. It's not the nicest answer, but and that's why I'm getting back to the Spotify model, which also isn't perfect, but at the very least, there is some form of reciprocity between author and platform. Yeah, I hope I answered your question at least indirectly, but.
One question about these shared libraries and problem about versioning. What is your opinion about, I think that basically it's a lack of knowledge and lack of deep understanding of shared libraries, and we are today we are facing the problem that many, for example, companies who are dealing with content management systems, they're just taking the parts, APIs, and connecting some templates without understanding how it works. And also, there is generally a problem that they are taking for granted that some API or JavaScript library will be on this address permanently, and problem of versioning. And I think that we need to change in way of thinking in education and also in development of software. So yeah. What is your...
I'm going to make a habit of answering questions indirectly. So, as I mentioned, at the moment, roughly 80% of my developer time goes into integrating stuff that was never designed to be integrated at all. There's a second problem. We're using a PHP framework that has 1,000 functionalities, 1,000 features. We're using maybe 10 of them, but still I have to include 10,000 lines of code that I'm actually not using, which are on their own attack vectors, technical depth, etc. I would love to have the ability of having a generative AI model just generate the stuff that I need and then implement my own code on top of it. Because the whole dependency hell that we have at the moment, and this is funny, I mean, I'm old enough to go through just about 3 different dependency apocalypses. We had Perl in the 90s, tried to even build anything on Perl that you built back in the day. Yeah. So then we had PHP, which also basically did the same thing. It exploded in 1 million different libraries and dependencies and whatnot. And now we have NPM and JavaScript doing the exact same thing. So hooray. It sounds a bit like what we had with smartphones, which basically in the early 10s repeated the Windows 95 DLL hell by just installing stuff, not maintaining it and whatnot. Main issue that I would like to see solved by actually generative AI, I want to just be able to generate the scaffolding code that I need to use in my project and not care about anything else, because then I can actually test and verify and not worry about the 10,000 features that I'm actually not using. I hope that at least, again, indirectly answered your question.
With very large neural network-based AI, such as ChatGPT backing GitHub Copilot, a lot of the source material is lost, and while some prompts can regurgitate a piece of code verbatim, most of it seems to be very generated. So how do you envisage that we can get the original context of that back to then reimburse the original creators that are being referenced when it's effectively referencing tens of thousands of different repositories?
It's a training problem. The data gets lost because we don't keep it alone in the training process. Neural networks at the moment, like ChatGPT, they do a lot of self-optimizing cycles while discarding whatever it is they used for those optimizing cycles. But that's a technical decision. If we simply retain references to the original training data throughout, sure, it would go at the cost of efficiency, it would use a lot of data, but actually the fun fact is OpenAI actually did it the other way around. They started analyzing output from GPT-2 using GPT-4 and then tracing back whatever was the point of origin. Now, to me that sounds slightly backwards, but it's a technical decision. If you want to be able to keep references to the original code, then that is possible. It just needs to be included in the training process and in the optimizing cycles. It's not an easy solution, but it's definitely possible. And of course, if you look into the duplication that's already out there of 1 million libraries doing roughly the same thing, yeah, how are you going to trace back who was the original creator? Yeah, that's a problem. I don't have an easy answer to that. It's kind of similar with, let's say, Vanilla Ice coming up with some that was definitely not clean. So, yeah. Anyone else? I think I'm actually in time at the moment, so hooray. Thank you for sticking around.